30 or even 50. But they're great. They're great projects. They're all tailored to the communities, of course. Most of these are rural, as you can see, but increasingly we're becoming involved in urban projects too. So, as I said, we've incorporated over 50 community land trusts, mostly as community benefit societies. So in that sense, they're constitutionally exactly the same as many housing associations that are also community benefit societies. And all of them have their own, carefully considered and highly customized logos. We've also worked with almost all the local authorities, about nearly 20 local authorities in our area. I think it's fair to say that 10 years ago, when I started working with these local authorities, they thought that community-led housing was great in theory, but wasn't really part of the solution to providing affordable homes, because at the time projects were taking a long time and were very, very time intensive for everyone. But the emergence of partnerships between, in our case, CLTs and RPs has really changed their minds, and they do see them very much as, in some parts, actually almost the default way of doing rural homes. But of course, they don't have, rural homes don't have to be provided this way. They can be provided in a traditional way by housing associations working on exception sites without the involvement of a CLT. And over that time, the number of housing associations that we've worked with has built up from 1 initially to 10 now, and they're all very different in nature and in size. And you can see the stock holdings here. A traditional rural housing association at the bottom, White Horse in Wiltshire, and Places for People, which most people know about, being one of the largest ones in the country. Of these housing associations that have decided to engage with this model, Aster has been the most committed, and it's great to have Karl here today, who's giving his time up freely, as always, with absolutely no ulterior motive in terms of wanting to develop in Kent, which I'm sure he will confirm later on. But Aster's been really committed, and their chief executive has been one of the standard bearers for partnerships with community-led housing organisations. Moving on to the actual partnership model itself, this is essentially what the model is. The community itself leads the project, so we work with them sometimes for a year or 2 years before a housing association becomes involved. We work with them to identify where the homes are going to be built, how many homes are going to be built, often tailored to the housing needs survey. We work with them to attract funding, to appoint their own design teams, and you can get revenue funding for CLTs now through, or you could, and we're hoping that there'll be more through Homes England, and to define the occupancy criteria. So in that sense, the CLT really does lead the project, shapes it in a way that it feels comfortable with, and once it's shaped, the selection of the RP partner happens amongst those RPs who are committed to this kind of approach. Legally, the CLT ends up owning the freehold, which they acquire for £1. The RP has a long-term lease, 125 years. Through that lease, they pay the land value, and of course, they fund and develop and operate the homes just as they normally would on their own site, except in this case, they're doing it under a lease. Now, when we started this, we wondered whether this model was going to be attractive to communities or housing associations. And I'm sure that, the questions around that have occurred to you. Why would a community want to work with a housing association when in some ways they're kind of giving away a large part of their project to another organisation? Similarly, why would a housing association want to work with a CLT when it could do this scheme itself? Anyway, the test of time has proven that the model is attractive to both parties. As far as Karl will talk about the attraction to housing associations shortly, so I won't steal his thunder on that. But for the CLTs, it has those benefits that I've listed there. Apart from leading the project, they become a party to any Section 106 agreement, so that can't be varied without their consent. They receive a ground rent as the freeholder, which we've, through experimentation, we found £4 per home per week is the way that that's calculated. That's paid by the RP directly to the CLT. The CLT has the option to buy the RP out at quite long intervals, admittedly, in order to ensure that the project remains fundable to the RPs and that they can secure loan finance against it. So the first buyout option is at 45 years and then at each period of 35 years thereafter. And also the involvement of a CLT prevents sales under the new right to shared ownership and the former voluntary right to buy, which is really important to all the communities that we work with. Just to give you 2 or 3 examples of projects before Karl takes over. This is, I like a challenge, and most of these projects are incredibly challenging. This one's in the AONB, the Cotswold AONB. It's also in the green belt around Bristol and Bath. So in two ways, it was going to be difficult to get planning consent for an exception site on the edge of Marshfield, particularly when we found after a couple of years of searching that none of the land immediately adjacent to the settlement boundary was actually available, and we had to go for this piece of land, which, as you can see, is 1 field removed from the settlement, which is over here. Nonetheless, it got planning consent about 6 months ago for a scheme of 18 units there, largely due to the work of the CLT in raising public support, and the planning application had, I think at the last count, 69 letters of support and 2 objections. So tremendous amount of support. And also the CLT's design team did a really good job of designing something that fitted in with the nature of the landscape. In this case, an agricultural, what you might call an agricultural typology was used, where you've got a layout that has a farmhouse configuration over here and a kind of converted stable and barn configuration over here. The AONB objected, but the landscape officer at the council supported the project. That's just one example of a rural project. In a more urban setting, I've got the town of Dorchester, 25,000 people. In a corner of the old Roman town, as you can see down here. I mean, the town's much bigger than this, but this is the old Roman town. There was a site right in the corner of the old Roman walls, so you've got the scheduled monument conservation area constraint straight away. It's also a brownfield site, as this plan over here shows. This brown area here is an old piece of disturbed ground, and it took quite a few goes to get the layout right. So these, it's not worth looking at in detail, but these coloured shapes here show the various different footprints we had for the scheme before we finally submitted the planning application that we felt would be acceptable. This is the actual project. It's 15 flats. Like Marshfield, actually, it's being built to passive house principles, so it'd be incredibly low energy to live in. Marshfield is also being built to social rents, whereas this one is being built to affordable rents because it's more expensive here. But a challenging urban brownfield site. And then the other application of the model, and I am stealing Karl's thunder slightly here, is where you've got a typical developer-led allocated housing site. in this case for 92 units, where 28 of them are affordable. So this foreground here is the new development, which is almost complete now. And what we've done is applied exactly the same model to the 28 affordable homes here. So Aster and Chagford Community Trust have taken the leasehold and freehold interests of those 28 affordables respectively. And that's the layout of that project. So the blue, brown, yellow and purple areas are the blocks of affordable housing which have been acquired by the partnership. And on a slightly smaller scale, also with Aster and with a different CLT, the same model's been applied to a scheme of 25 homes, of which 6 are affordable in a typical small village. So this is the project. The affordables are here, and the rest of it is converted barns and open market housing. Just to summarise my bit, as I said, the CLTs under this model are heavily involved in shaping the projects before an RP becomes involved. The way we operate it anyway. There are no actual rules to how you do this, but this is the way we operate it. And when the RP becomes involved, they can see very, oops, sorry about that, Karl. They can see very clearly what the nature of the project is, and they can decide then whether they want to become involved or not. Supported by us as technical advisors and brokers of the relationship. So I'll pass on to you, Karl, now, if that's okay. And yeah, just give me the word as and when you want me to move the slides forward.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So just to give you a few words or an overview of the RP perspective, could you skip forward, Steve? Thank you. So yeah, that's our tagline. We could probably skip that. Just sort of emphasises the fact that we're a very development-focused organisation. So I won't dwell too much on this, but Aster operates across the south of England, from Devon and Cornwall across to West Sussex and Surrey, not as far as Kent. We're a sort of medium-large size HA, owning about 33,000 homes, and we've got a very big development programme. So I think last year we delivered just under 1,200 homes, which nationally I think puts us quite near the top of the list, or probably at the top of the list in terms of the ratio of new homes built to existing stock. And where that comes in respect to CLTs really is that it firstly means we have to charge everything we build, but secondly, I think the scale of Aster does allow us to take risks with some of the more challenging projects and enable us to be quite flexible with what we're doing. Thanks, Steve. So, sorry. Well, we probably don't need to dwell on the financial profile page, but just emphasise what I said. We've got a strong financial profile, which perhaps allows us to support some sort of outlier projects that we might not be able to if we were a smaller RP. So we've delivered 12 schemes to date now, partnership schemes, with the 12th handing over yesterday and the 13th due to hand over in the first week of the new year, which I think is more than any other RP has done. And that comes from strong commitment to community-led housing and CLTs right from the board level and the chief exec down to the frontline staff. So I work exclusively on CLT schemes. I've been at Aster for 10 years and working just on CLTs for the last 8 years, many of those projects with Steve and with Middlemarch. I've also got a project manager who helps me out with that. So as well as 12 schemes we've delivered to date, I've got about 15 or 16 in the pipeline at various stages, and quite a few of those are quite advanced. So we're hoping to submit planning applications on about 6 or 7 of those by the spring. So it's quite busy at the moment. And you can see there's a couple of photos of completed projects down in Dorset and Devon. Thanks, Steve. So I thought it would be worth running through quite quickly an example project. And this is really a typical Aster CLT scheme, being a small development on a rural exception site in an area where there's a high level of housing need, low level of affordable delivery historically, and a very, very challenging site. So in Appledore, which is in Torridge in North Devon, the second home ownership rate is 42%. as I say, no new affordable housing had been delivered for a long time, several decades, I think. So the local community took matters into their own hands and took the bold step of purchasing a site with their own funds. We picked up, we became involved, picked up the project in 2015, and had a challenging couple of years trying to secure planning permission and grant funding. So the ground conditions there were incredibly challenging. There were lots of legal issues as well. There was a neighbouring estate owned by another HA that had a ransom or controlled the access. I think the local authority had a ransom strip as well. The drainage runs were incredibly long down the hill, and there were all kinds of other site-specific issues there, which is quite typical, I think. And one of the things that makes the CLT projects challenging for us isn't necessarily the CLT involvement, it's more that the sites that are chosen tend to be the best sites for the community, but maybe not the best sites in development terms sometimes, whether that's due to availability or community preference. That can add challenges. The grant rate ended up being a little bit over £144,000 per home, which was by far the highest for any scheme that we've delivered, and probably one of the highest, I think, for Homes England, if not the highest. And that grant was pieced together. And what we're finding now is that we try to take the attitude that the scheme, if it's a good scheme, it will be funded, even if we don't know at the outset how it will be funded. We kind of press on that assumption and piece together the funding. So typically we put in a lot of internal subsidy, RCGF, into CLT schemes now. We try to push for as much funding as possible from Homes England. The local authorities we work with do tend to chip in quite a lot of funding as well, and we look at other sort of innovative ways of securing funding as well. So it's quite typical for 3 or 4 different funding streams to come together on one project. So yeah, that was Appledore, but probably one of the best schemes we've done. It was only 9 units for affordable rent, but a really great group and something we're very proud of. I think the photo there shows it mid construction. It's probably blended in a bit better into the landscape now. Okay, thanks, Steve. So yeah, so just picking up that sort of innovation theme, just picking up on three schemes that we've completed that were a bit different. So at Nailsworth, which is in Stroud local authority, Stroud district in Gloucestershire, we got planning permission there via a community right to build order rather than a planning application. That was an urban scheme, and there was a really good turnout for the referendum and quite an overwhelming vote in support. And that was the site where the local authority transferred the freehold to the CLT for £1. It was an old garage site, so that was yeah, really good project, one we're very proud of. Chagford was the Section 106 scheme that Steve touched on. Increasingly, we're looking at delivering more Section 106 CLT schemes, including some quite big schemes. So I'm looking at one at the moment on a sort of strategic site where you're looking at 500 affordable homes over 10 years. I think the key for so most of the schemes we've done have been rural exception sites. The key for the 106 CLT schemes is you've got to get in there early with the landowner, I think, because there's no real way of securing CLT involvement via Section 106 agreement. You can have quite a lot of nice wording in there about involving the CLT, but really, if you want to secure involvement, the landowner's got to be on board from an early stage, I think, is what we found. And then Tollopacorum's the smallest scheme we've done, well, joint smallest with the new Bishop's Cornwall scheme that Steve also mentioned, 6 homes. And the interesting thing about that one was that we also built a new post office. So the post office in the village had an insecure lease. The lease was running out, and it was really the last community facility in the village after the loss of the pub. So it was great to be able to sort of save that, relocate it to new premises, build some affordable homes for local people. And we did actually sort of future-proof it by ensuring that the post office, if there's no longer a need for it in the future, could be converted to a residential unit. So it was a ground floor maisonette, effectively, ground floor flat. Thanks, Steve. So in terms of the challenges of CLT schemes, apart from the tricky sites, charging is a big one for us. And it took years and years for me to be able to demonstrate to Aster's Treasury team that we can actually charge CLT schemes at market value. So all of our newer schemes since 2015, 2016 automatically go through and get charged at market value. I've had to go back and get deeds of variation for the leases and Section 106 agreements for a lot of the historic older schemes pre-2015. And I've managed to do that in all cases, I think, apart from one. I think now that Aster's board's confident that we can charge these schemes, they are even more supportive and more willing to support them. And I know that there's another HA in the southwest that's also was actually slightly ahead of us and has managed to charge a couple of their CLT schemes at market value too. So it's quite accepted now. We know what we need to do to achieve that, and it's all around making sure that the wording's correct in the lease. And the real big difference between the new schemes and what we used to have in the old schemes was, as Steve said, the buyback the CLT can exercise has been pushed out to year 45, and that just gives lenders that comfort that their loan security isn't going to disappear at any point. Yeah, that's been one of the best developments over the last year or two. In terms of financial viability, I think I probably mentioned that it tends to be the schemes in areas where the incomes are lower and the market's not as good that tend to be more challenging, because it's not just a case of drawing down lots of grant funding. We also have to be mindful of the cost to value ratio, and that's been an issue in places like North Devon. And you often there also get that compounded by the fact that our framework contractors don't work there because it's a geographic sort of outlier area, and there aren't many good small, medium-sized contractors. So often the location can be quite decisive in terms of how difficult it is to deliver a scheme. But yeah, viability is always a challenge, especially now. Steve said we're looking at a lot of social rent schemes almost as a default position. So yeah, that's not particularly getting any easier. And then scheme design, I think every scheme involves compromise. Some CLTs are more into the design than others. Some are very, very keen on being really heavily involved. And what we found is where CLTs have picked up community housing revenue funding, that's been great. And it gives them more ownership of the process, where they're appointing consultants directly. It's de-risked the schemes for Aster to a certain extent, and we've been able to pursue very challenging projects in the knowledge that it's really only my time and perhaps some legal fees that are being spent at risk. We do reserve a bit of funding to chip in if there are additional surveys needed and the CLTs can't quite cover them. But just knowing that, I mean, some of the CLTs we're working with at the moment spent 6 figures on their planning applications. So that's been key. And I think what I've tried to do on a lot of projects is encourage the CLT to come up with a wish list of what they want to see incorporated, and then try to tick off as much of that as possible. But, you know, being clear from the outset that they won't be able to get everything they want. It's not really feasible to deliver a scheme with natural stone, slate roofs to passive house standards for social rent on an exception site that's very steeply sloping. So it's about picking and choosing. Thanks, Steve. So why do these schemes work for Aster? I think it's been our involvement in these schemes has been a really positive thing, especially over the last few years as momentum's been gathered really in the sector and there's more awareness now. I think the publicity that's been generated has been great, raises awareness to the Aster brand and what we're trying to do. Steve mentioned some of our schemes have been on Country File and in the national press, which is really good. Get a lot of kudos from local authorities, central government. Homes England are always very keen to hear what we've been doing. And yeah, I think appreciate that we're tackling some of these projects. And what we've also found is as we're moving into new areas of operation, you have to work quite closely with the local authorities on these schemes. And that's been really good, sort of fast tracking those relationships at a strategic level. So yeah, that's been very helpful. I think it's also just I think it's quite a nice thing for the staff to know that we're doing these schemes that really there's no financial motive generally for doing these schemes, so it is it's a nice sort of corporate social responsibility type aspect to it. And generally people in different departments of Aster do really enjoy working with the CLTs. Something different, it's quite interesting. So I think it's been good from that perspective as well. Thanks, Steve. So a few lessons learned in terms of working with the CLTs. I think establishing heads of terms early is great. And on the schemes where we work with Steve, that's something that happens automatically. So when we are interviewed, they're already heads of terms in draft form with the CLT. and tripartite heads of terms between us, the CLT, and the landowner. So that's really good. From my perspective, have to ensure all the consultants understand how the relationship works between Aster and the CLT and the importance of that relationship. It's quite useful, I think, to speak to CLTs about who does what within the group, so that the workload doesn't fall all completely on one person, which is the risk. Lesson learned there, I've had a CLT where there was one chap doing almost everything, and then he left the group, which isn't ideal. So it's good to split that workload, and often you'll find that there are people with expertise within the group. And we've had everything from groups where there are people with no professional expertise in the group, which is fine, to groups where you've got architects and lawyers and engineers and contractors on the group. Pros and cons of both, really. Takes away some of the project management time. If you've got that level of expertise on a group, it can be genuinely really helpful. But you're probably scrutinised a bit more. So from that side, can be a bit more challenging. I think bringing specialist expertise in at the correct time is key as well, and often that's internally from within Aster. So making sure that the lettings manager for that area comes in and talks to the group in detail about the local allocations plan, maybe bringing in someone from asset, being quite open book in terms of finances, maybe not sitting down with the pro-val, but talking through the headline figures so that the group understands the financial pressures on the scheme, and just making sure that the CLT understands the timescale and our decision-making process, so the internal approval journey as the scheme goes through that process. And also any red lines for us, so things like charging is the big one for us. We need to be able to charge the scheme. That's non-negotiable. So anything that we need to do that just has to happen, basically. And it's just making that clear from the outset. Thanks, Steve.
That's it, Karl. That's just the summary of the model to end with. But we're done. Kirsty.
Yeah, thank you, Steve and Karl. That was interesting. Really does highlight the benefits of collaboration there. And I hope everyone enjoyed listening to that. So we're going to now go to some questions. And Steve, can you see this chat here, Steve and Karl? Question from Naomi. How do we encourage the RPs in Kent to work with our groups? Firstly.
Well, I'd say, take heart from our experience, because the last 10 years we've spent a lot of time on this model, refining it and getting it to the stage where it is now, bringing major players like Homes England and the NHF and so on into supporting the model, and so that the groundwork has been done. If there's any questions that need to be answered, I'm sure we can answer them. I'm sure both of us would be willing to spend time with individual RPs if they wanted, a more in-depth, or not necessarily more in-depth, but a presentation of this type, to their exec teams or boards. Our time is limited to a certain extent in that respect, but we're just keen to encourage others to become involved, because the Asters of this world have done a great job, but there's no way that Karl would say he had the capacity to meet the demand.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's right. And I think also it's important for RPs to know why they're working with CLTs, if they are, why they're doing it, and to be flexible, so you're not trying to force a CLT scheme through the usual benchmarks and parameters that you otherwise would do. So usually we wouldn't look at a 10-unit or a 6-unit scheme, but if it's a CLT scheme, we'll make that exception. The CLT schemes only have to break even. We're not looking to make a financial surplus, as we usually would on standard schemes. And I think it's just about flexibility the whole way through. Bespoke lettings plans. As long as you know what your red lines are, then I think it's fine to be really quite flexible. I think you need to be.
And the second part here of Naomi's question, the new Affordable Housing Fund and the right to shared ownership doesn't apply to CLTs, but how will it affect the partnership agreement as we're talking about them today?
Well, I mean, the exemption for CLTs means that the partnership agreement won't be dead in the water, basically, to put it bluntly, because all of these communities are prepared to give huge amounts of voluntary time into these projects. I mean, the average length of a project that we've been involved with is about 6 years. Some are shorter, but 1 or 2 have been longer. And they don't put that voluntary time in, as I'm sure people can imagine, if they think that the rented homes that they produce are going to be lost to the open market at some point in the future. So the exemption under the voluntary right to buy, which is rather withered on the vine, and now under the right to shared ownership, are absolutely critical to chiming in with that motivation. So I'd say that, and I suppose what surprised me about this one was it came so easily. It was as if the ministry had already computed that if it was going to introduce a new right to ownership, some form of right to ownership, then it stood to reason that CLT projects were going to have to be exempt. It was a much harder battle. Well, it was a battle over the voluntary right to buy, but this time it just came, as if the ministry had accepted that in order to kind of continue with this model, this kind of exemption needed to be made.
Okay. And a question here from Andy. Can you explain, I think this is possibly for Karl, can you explain the significance of charging at market value?
Yeah, so in the development model, we generate the funds to develop affordable homes by borrowing against completed homes. And to make sure that we can do that, we have to make sure the Section 106 agreement for all schemes allows us to do so with mortgage exemption clause in place. And for CLT schemes, we need to make sure that the lease mirrors that and also allows us to borrow. And in terms of market value specifically, it means we can borrow on average across our stock about £95,000 per home. So the two levels of borrowing really: there's market value and there's existing use value of social housing. So to give you an idea of the difference, if we can borrow £95,000 from a home that's charged at market value, that might only be 45,000 or 50,000 if we charged it at existing use value. So our business plan is predicated on the fact that all the homes we build will be charged at market value. So that's an absolute requirement. And that is just so important for us. I think our board would consider a scheme that you couldn't charge to be almost a waste of resources, a waste of investment, because we could have used that money to build a scheme that we would be able to charge at market value, and then be able to use that to build more homes. And as I say, I think there's a pressure on all RPs to do that, probably more on Aster than most, because our development program is so big compared to our stock base.
Okay, thanks, Karl. Did I see someone with their hand up just before then?
Yeah, that was me. Brian Horton. Couple of things really. Going back to the original question is how, in terms of how you get traction in Kent, the reality is you're going to need exec level support for the concept, both in the RPs but from the local authorities. So in terms of marketing this, then I'd suggest that we try and get this on the radar of the Kent chiefs. That might be via someone like Tracy Curley at Ashford. If we can get her interest, I know she's got an active interest in rural homes, and if this is a way, a new way of bringing exception sites forward in rural areas, then I think that there's a route there, and I'm happy to help make a connection there if that's helpful. I think also through Kent Housing Group, I sit on the KHG exec board. I think that a presentation like we've had as a kind of peer-to-peer presentation to the Kent Housing Group would be helpful. KHG basically has all of the active RPs and the local authorities across Kent and Medway. So 14 local authorities, probably 20 plus RPs are represented there. So that's a good way of raising the profile of the issues. Frankly though, the problem is that these projects are too small for most RPs now, and also too much bother, if we're being honest about this. And I mean, I think all power to Aster but you spoke about your chief exec and board being behind what you're doing. That's why you're doing this. If they weren't, you wouldn't be doing it, because the time it takes to bring a forward like this, like the time you have to invest in a rural exception site, is disproportionate to the officer time and the potential risk of failure compared to doing 50 to 100 or 200 homes as part of your portfolio of delivery. So you really need, like you've done this morning, to get the narrative about the added value that it can bring, the relationships, and the ability to bring schemes forward that otherwise wouldn't do. But it needs to, you have to kind of get heart as well as mind, as well as FD and chief exec and all those other elements in there if we're going to get traction.
Okay, duly noted there. I saw Tessa there making some notes.
And Tessa, whoever's linking, I'm happy to help navigate some of that if that's helpful in terms of some of the Kent structures.
Okay, great, thank you. Back on the chat there, Karl and Steve, question from Mateus. Could you elaborate on potential funding streams only available when working with CLTs?
Yeah, the main one that we've been using, Kirsty, is the revenue grants that have been available through mostly through Homes England, but also through actually quite a lot of the local authorities in our area, following the distribution by the ministry directly to local authorities in 2017. That grant is now running out, so that's why we've been using Homes England's revenue stream mainly, and that revenue grant has been available to community-led housing groups to to carry out feasibility work and to prepare and submit planning applications. And as Karl said, that sometimes runs into 6 figures on the larger or more challenging or both sites. Now that funding stream finished at the end of March this year, but we're optimistic that it's going to be renewed from April this year, because I think that, and I've got no firm basis for saying this, I think that the ministry realizes that the de-risking of challenging sites is a very direct way of bringing more affordable housing forward. It is around the edges, admittedly, you know, it's not the thousands, but it brings sites into use that otherwise no other organisation would attempt to develop. Okay, great, thank you. Kimber, I saw you with your hand up there. You put your mic on. Yeah.
Steve, it's I sat on a meeting last week. I think Emma from Canterbury was there as well, with Nigel Kersney from the MHCLG and another chap, can't think of his name right now, from Homes England. And they were saying that that pot is going to be much, much, much smaller this time round, like much smaller. Indications, I thought, I'm not sure if Emma can remember, but I thought they said about £4 million. So I'm not sure. They want all applications for, well, I suppose capital funding is different, but the revenue funding is going to be a lot less, apparently. That's what they said. Yeah, I think the fact that it will exist at all is going to be a good thing. Because other forms of community, the other streams of what was the community housing fund don't look likely to be renewed at all. But they want it all to go through the affordable housing programme. Yeah, I mean the capital isn't really a problem, you know, because under partnerships, the RPs just access the affordable homes programme in the way they normally do. And Homes England have different benchmarks for community housing projects because they realise that they tend to be in, you know, more expensive areas. And just so we're clear, that the figures that Karl gave for the Appledore project at 144 grand a unit, that's not Homes England funding. As Karl said, that's a combination of a lot of money from the local authority, quite a bit of Aster's internal resources, and a benchmarked contribution from Homes England. But I think it's great that revenue funding is going to exist in some form. We'll certainly carry on using it. Yeah. Thank you, Kimber. And from Liz. Hi, Liz.
With the RP's involvement on nominations sourced via the local authority housing register, with priority given to those who meet the CLT's allocation requirements.
Yes. Yeah,
Yes.
we always use the existing housing register. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. And Kimber, were all of these schemes social or affordable rented homes? Were any shared ownership? And if so, how did this work?
Yeah, there's a small amount of shared ownership, isn't there, Karl? Usually pretty small, 10 to 20% at most. And it works in the same way, basically. The CLT has the freehold, the housing association has the lease of the whole project, and then there's an underlease to each of the shared owners.
Okay.
I think in terms of the shared ownership, we've been happy to do, as Steve says, small amounts. I guess it's the 80% staircasing restriction that might pose a bit of a sales risk to HAs if you've got a lot of shared ownership units on one site with that restriction. So we tend to look at it on a case-by-case basis. And generally, I don't know if you'd agree, Steve, but most CLTs see the biggest need as being for rented homes. So often they're quite happy to do a scheme 100% for rent, which to a certain extent it suits us quite well too.
Yeah.
Okay. Kimber, you had your hand up again.
Yeah, just to add, because I know just from talking to different local authorities that they seem to be pushing for a bit more shared ownership on some of the community-led housing project sites. And my understanding is, I don't know, because my understanding is not very broad at the moment, but they can't restrict who they sell them to. So therefore they can't be restricted to the community-led housing group. Is that right?
Yeah. No, they can be if they're on an exception site.
When you say, rural, you mean rural exception site?
If they're in a designated rural parish, yeah.
Yeah, but if they're not, they can't be.
No, that's right.
No.
Yeah. Okay. From Liz, can open market homes for sale to local buyers help cross subsidy?
Yeah, we've got one project where it was the Marshfield one actually that I gave as an example, where United Communities is selling 3 properties to cross subsidise. I'm not sure that it's a model that we'd want to enthusiastically develop though, because these projects take long enough that you can never quite tell what the state of the housing market is going to be when the time comes to sell the homes. So, you know, relying on sales is obviously a risk. And while Homes England is willing to, well, a combination of Homes England and local authorities and RPs are willing to fund these things without cross subsidy, it's a more straightforward route.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Would anyone else like to? Yeah, Brian?
Yeah, just when you were talking about the local authority investment, is that through commuted sums that they've taken in lieu of Section 106 affordable housing? Or if not, where's that money come from within the local authority?
Well, a lot of good question, Brian. A lot of the local authorities in our area were among the 48 that received Community Housing Fund grant directly from the ministry in 2017. You know, on the basis of having high levels of second home ownership. So some of them received over $1 million. One received over 2 million, and some of that is still remaining. So that's been used. But elsewhere, yes, it's been, you know, obviously commuted some pots are often quite healthy as well in anywhere in the south generally, because of the amount of you know, volume builder development going on.
Well, money gets collected and often the local authorities struggle to then deploy it. So it could be, I could see being attractive as a way of delivering schemes in that way potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Brian. Graham, did you have your hand up? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I'm from English Rural, and I'm pleased to say that we actually submitted our first, the planning application for the first CLT scheme in partnership last week. Yeah. So yeah, there's been a really good partnership arrangement. We've learned a lot. I think the CLT have had a lot of skills that they could inject into the process. So it was really just a kind of an update, really, that it can work, and we're on board with it. And yeah, we found the process quite smooth, really. Obviously, it has the usual development challenges. We have 3, or the CLT has 3 open market units for cross subsidy, and that's part of the the financial viability. But of course, we're not relying on that solely. So, as Steve said, but good experience. I think we're probably suited to CLT sites because our average scheme size is 8. So we do work perhaps the more trickier sites in smaller numbers. So, but overall, very good experience. So,
can we just ask where? Is that in Kent?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's Shepherdswell and Coldred.
Is that Canterbury or Dover?
It's Dover.
Dover. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So is that official now, Graham? Can I put it in this month's newsletter now?
Yes, it's been it's been the application's made. So yeah.
Fantastic. Well done.
Okay. All right.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. And Kimber has a comment here. Don't think Kent local authorities received as much in CLH grants as the South West LAs. FHDC had less than $500,000. I don't know how that compares, Steve and Karl.
Yeah, actually, quite a lot of the Southwest ones had $500,000 or less as well. It was just a couple like South Devon and Cornwall had, and South Dorset had very large amounts, but a lot of the others had $500,000 or less. But it is starting to run out now. I mean, it's been great in that it's made them more ready to put money into these projects, and as the projects have. It's interesting. I mean, one of our main contacts, Karl and I, is a guy called Paul Derrian, who is the strategic enabler for Dorset, the new unitary authority. And his line is quite simple. He said, "Sometimes I don't know how they work, but the main thing is they always seem to. It's because you've got volunteers, who do grab you by the heart." Let's once you're involved with those projects, we are all determined to see them through. I mean, when I say all of us, even Homes England as well, be prepared to commit themselves to seeing these projects through, because we know that for us, these projects, although they're not efficient in terms of adding to the national housing supply, it's the only way they're ever going to get anything. If they just sit there and wait for someone else to provide it, it's not going to happen. So, on that basis, we really want to see these projects, succeed. And the funding that came through in 2017 has made the local authorities a bit more relaxed about taking a risk on them. And what they've found is that risk almost always pays off in a completed project. It might have been challenging, it might have taken a long time, it might have, almost deal breakers might almost have scuppered it, but time and time again they come through. We even had 3 projects now that have been granted planning consent, one on an overturned recommendation for refusal on landscape impact grounds, and 2 as departures from the local plan because they were deemed to be in areas that were unsustainable for development because they were too rural. So, we sort of have that confidence that the narrative will carry the project through even where the planning policy is against it.
May I ask, have you been able to sustain the kind of very special circumstances argument with CLTs, or I wonder, say how you're getting round some of those planning objections?
Yeah, it's the community narrative, Brian. The fact that these people have committed themselves, so much of their time over quite a few years in some cases, to do what no one else would do because it doesn't make kind of business sense. Yeah. And of course the evidence is there of the homes being needed. These schemes aren't off the scale in that sense. But the last one was only about a month ago, and it was the first one that had been, the planning report said this is a departure from the local plan, but the planning case office said we're going to recommend it anyway on its merits. And I kind of expect the planning case officers to use the fact that it's a departure from the local plan to recommend it for refusal. You know, I think that I kind of thought that was their job, you know, and then to allow the planning committee to overturn their recommendation. I'm not suggesting they're complicit in that, but, you know, I thought that was the way it worked. But for planning officers to say it is a departure and we're going to recommend it was great.
I suppose that's the point where I came to the special circumstances, because if they're going to do that, they need to have a narrative on the reasons why they're recommending approval on something that sits outside the local plan.
Yeah, they do.
And yeah, I think from what I've seen from Aster Group and Wessex Community Assets, Dave, that you've been really heavily involved in, is that ability to really tell the story and complete with, I mean, I don't know how many, you know, videos and things I've watched that really do get across the need for community-led housing. And it is so important that CLTs build that as well into their offering to garner local support, because it really does tell, that's telling the story. So you saying about, you know, kind of almost like pulling on the heartstrings a little bit, it really does help. And I think that's what Wessex Community Assets have done really well. You know, they've really shown the impact of it. So, yeah.
That, and the BBC really get that as well. As Karl and I found, whenever they cover one of these projects, we don't appear anywhere. The local authority doesn't appear anywhere. Nobody appears anywhere except the community, because they realise that that's where the story is. And much as our colleagues might want to, you know, see us given some credit in that process, we're long since reconciled to the fact that that's not the way the narrative works.
Not about you. Yeah. Okay, we are bang on 11 o'clock. Does anyone have any final questions for Steve and Karl before we start wrapping up? Yeah, Liz, go on. Have your mic on, Liz.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to, sorry, I did type it in, but it was right at the end. So do you find that CLTs are mainly populated by parish council representatives? If so, to get this message across about the value that CLTs can bring, I wonder if a presentation of this type could be given to the Kent Parish Council Group, which is Clc. I think it's about getting the message out there about what, you know, what local groups can do and achieve, and as you say, sort of tugging at the heartstrings and the local story. Because, you know, it's getting the message out there, isn't it?
Yeah,
I think there's two things there, Liz. First of all, we'd always engage with a parish council or a town council when first engaging with the community, because it's you obviously you need their support for the principle of a community-led housing project, and you need them to set up the public meeting, whether it's online or in real life, to explain the concept to the community and to ask for volunteers. What they're often skeptical about is that any volunteers will come forward, and they tend to say, well, you know, we're just a bit worried that we'll be left having to run this thing, you know, and we're already really busy. What invariably happens though is volunteers do come forward who are attracted to the idea of a social enterprise like a community land trust, which is going to develop projects as opposed to be involved in the kind of governance issues that a parish council or a town council is involved in. So volunteers do come forward, and what I've found is that parish and town councils are generally really relieved and pleased to know that there's another group that is focusing on the affordable housing issue, and that they don't have to carry it forward entirely themselves. Now there's often a smattering of parish councillors on the CLT board, but not a majority most of the time. Most of the time it's fresh volunteers.
I suppose that's helpful when they then, you know, as a statutory consultee, when they have to consider the planning application when it comes through, you know, they're not completely wedded in with the CLT. You know, you keep the division of power.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. No, thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, as Tessa said there, that the hub has presented to parish councils, and we're organising a more focused session for for March next year. So yeah, it's definitely on our radar. Yeah. Okay.
May I make just one final point? It's just,
yeah, sure.
Just I work a lot with the Kent Developers Group, and also increasingly now that with an SME network of developers. And one of the problems that developers have, smaller developers, is getting their Section 106 requirements away with RPs, because the RPs don't want the smaller elements. And I just wonder, is there a way of joining up SMEs in terms of sites that they're bringing forward with CLTs potentially locally, as a win-win for both sides there, including the local authorities who struggle with some of the smaller 106s, and those on the call that have been part of the Housing Strategy Enabling Group in Kent are aware that that's been an issue for quite a lot of the local authorities in Kent.
Yep. Who wants to
I could make a comment.
make
Yeah,
a
we
comment?
we do have the same sort of issue with small offerings of affordable homes on Section 106 sites, and also just small schemes, but small exception sites, Brian. And although there are some RPs like English Rural and one or two of the ones that I mentioned who are willing to do the sort of half dozens, there aren't very many, and they don't have a huge amount of capacity. So we're always, in fact, for the last 5 years, we've been on the verge of setting up a new RP, particularly to fill that gap in the market, but we haven't quite got to the point where we need it yet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.